In the winter of 1884, 14 men sat around a table in Berlin and divided up a continent none of them had ever set foot on. There was one small problem. Nobody invited the continent. Rewind to 1870. Europeans had traded on Africa's coasts for 400 years, but they controlled barely 10% of it. The interior? Off limits. Powerful kingdoms like the Ashanti, the Zulu and Ethiopia ran their own affairs. Malaria killed European explorers so reliably that West Africa was nicknamed the white man's grave. So Africa stayed African. And then, in the space of one generation, 3 inventions flipped the board. Invention 1, quinine, a bitter powder from tree bark that stopped malaria from wiping out European armies. Invention 2, the steamship, which could push up rivers no sailing vessel could touch. Invention 3, the big one, the Maxim gun, the first true machine gun, 600 rounds a minute against armies carrying spears and muskets. One British writer summed up the entire era in a single rhyme. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. The door to Africa wasn't opened. It was blown off its hinges. November 1884. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck calls a meeting. 13 European powers plus the United States show up to answer one question: who gets what? For 104 days they negotiate, trade, and bluff. King Leopold of Belgium walks away with the entire Congo as his personal private property. Not Belgium's. Here's an area 76 times the size of Belgium, owned by one man. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. In 104 days of deciding Africa's future, the number of Africans in the room was 0. Berlin produced a rule book, and its core rule was called effective occupation. Translation: claiming land on paper wasn't enough. You had to physically occupy it. Flags, forts, soldiers, which sounds reasonable until you realize what it actually did. It turned colonization into a race. Every European power now had a deadline. Grab it, garrison it, or lose it to your neighbor. The scramble wasn't a side effect. It was the rules working exactly as designed. Then came the borders. Diplomats in Europe drew lines across maps of places they couldn't pronounce, using rivers they'd never seen, and, very often, just a ruler. Today, roughly 40% of Africa's borders are straight lines. Straight lines don't happen in nature. They happen when someone in a drawing room doesn't care what's underneath. Ethnic groups were sliced in half. Rival kingdoms were fused into single colonies. One British diplomat later admitted, "We have been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where they were." So what was it all for? One word: extraction. Rubber, ivory, gold, diamonds, palm oil, out of Africa into European factories. Nowhere was it darker than Leopold's Congo. Villagers were given rubber quotas. Missed the quota, and the punishment was mutilation or death. Historians estimate the population of the Congo fell by up to 10 million people in 20 years. When the truth leaked, the global outrage was so intense that in 1908 Belgium confiscated the colony from its own king. The machine kept running. Now, the part your textbook probably skipped, Africa did not roll over. Samurai Toure built a West African empire that fought France for 16 years. The Zulu annihilated a British column at Isandlwana in 1879. And then there's Ethiopia. In 1896, Italy marched in, expecting an easy win. Emperor Menelik II met them at Adwa with 100,000 troops and crushed them. A European power defeated outright by an African one. Italy signed a treaty recognizing Ethiopia's independence, and every empire in Europe quietly took Ethiopia off the menu. But Adwa was the exception. By 1914, just 30 years after Berlin, the map was unrecognizable. France held a block of West Africa bigger than the continental United States. Britain ran a corridor from Cairo to Cape Town. Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Italy, all fed. Out of the entire continent, exactly 2 states remained independent: Ethiopia, which had won its independence on the battlefield, and Liberia. 90% of Africa, taken in less time than a single human generation. Here's where the story refuses to stay in the past. When independence finally swept Africa in the 1950s and 60s, the new nations faced an impossible choice: redraw the colonial borders and risk endless war over every line or keep them. In 1964, the Organization of African Unity chose to keep them, which means the ruler lines drawn in Berlin drawing rooms are, overwhelmingly, the borders on your phone's map app right now. 50-plus countries, their shapes decided by men who never saw them. Economists still measure the cost. Split ethnic groups, landlocked states, borders that cut straight through trade routes that had existed for 1,000 years. 14 men, one table, or 104 days, 0 Africans. The Scramble for Africa is usually told as a story about greed, and it is. But it's really a story about a question that was never asked. What did the people who lived there want? Nobody in Berlin asked it in 1884, and the entire century that followed, the extraction, the resistance, the wars of independence, the borders we still live with, was the bill for skipping that one question. History doesn't repeat, but it does send invoices. If you want the next one before it arrives, subscribe.